That the editor felt some apprehension over the result was discernible from his italicized note preceding the article, in which he disclaimed, on grounds of fair-mindedness, any responsibility for what he was now printing in his own paper. With this auspicious beginning, and under the heading, "The Devil and the Deeps," Bocker led off. Never since the days when Noah was building his ark has there been such a well-regimented turning of blind eyes as during the last year. It cannot go on. Soon, now, the long Arctic night will be over. Observation will again be possible. Then the eyes that should never have been shut must open. That beginning I remember, but without references I can only give the gist and a few recollected phrases of the rest. This, Bocker continued, is the latest chapter in a long tale of futility and failure stretching back to the sinkings of the Yatsushiro and the Keweenaw and beyond. Failure which has already driven us from the seas and now threatens us on the land. I repeat, failure. This is a word so little to our taste that many think it is a virtue to claim that they never admit it. But blind stupidity is not one of the virtues. It is a weakness, and in this case it is a dangerous weakness, masked by a false optimism. All about us are unrest, inflating prices, whole economic structures changing, and therefore a way of life that is changing. All about us, too, are people who talk about our exclusion from the high seas as though it were some temporary inconvenience, soon to be corrected. To this smugness there is a reply. It is this. For over 5 years now, the best, the most agile, the most inventive brains in the world have wrestled with the problem of coming to grips with our enemy, and they are still no closer to a solution than when they began. There is, on their present findings, nothing at all to indicate that we shall ever be able to sail the seas in peace again. With the word failure so wry in our mouths, it has apparently been policy to discourage any expression of the connection between our maritime troubles and the recent developments in the Arctic and Antarctic. It is time for this attitude of not before the children to cease. I do not know, and I do not care what kind of pressure has been preventing our more percipient men from pointing out this connection. There are always cliques and factions anxious to keep the public in the dark for its own good. A good that is seldom far from the interests of the faction advocating it. I do not suggest that the root problem is being neglected. Far from it. There have been and are men wearing themselves out to find some means by which we can locate and destroy the enemy in our deeps. What I do say is that with them still unable to find a way, we now face the most serious assault yet. It is an assault against which we have no defences. It is not susceptible of direct attack. It can be checked only by our discovery of some means of destroying its high command in the deeps. And what is this weapon to which we can oppose no counter? It is the melting of the Arctic ice, and a great part of the Antarctic ice too. You think that fantastic? Too colossal? It is not. It is a task which we could have undertaken ourselves, had we so wished, at any time since we released the power of the atom. Because of the winter darkness, little has been heard lately of the patches of Arctic fog. It is not generally known that, though 2 of them existed in the Arctic spring, by the end of the Arctic summer there were 8, in widely separated areas. Now, fog is caused, as you know, by the meeting of hot and cold currents of either air or water. How does it happen that 8 novel, independent warm currents can suddenly occur in the Arctic? And the results? Unprecedented flows of broken ice into the Bering Sea and into the Greenland Sea. In these 2 areas particularly, the pack ice is hundreds of miles north of its usual spring maximum. In other places, to the north of Norway, for instance, it is further south, and we ourselves had an unusually cold, wet winter. And the icebergs. We've all read a lot about them and seen a lot of pictures of them lately. Why? Obviously because there are a great many more icebergs than usual. But the question that no one has publicly answered is, why should there be more icebergs? Everyone knows where they are coming from. Greenland is a large island, greater than 9 times the size of the British Isles, but it is more than that. It is also the last great bastion of the retreating Ice Age. Several times the ice has come south, grinding and scouring, smoothing the mountains, scooping the valleys on its way until it stood in huge ramparts, dizzy cliffs of glass-green ice, vast, slow-crawling glaciers across half Europe. Then it went back, gradually over centuries, back and back. The huge cliffs and mountains of ice dwindled away, melted, and were known no more except in one place. Only in Greenland does that immemorial ice still tower 9,000 feet high, unconquered yet. And down its sides slide the glaciers which spawn the icebergs. They have been scattering their icebergs into the sea season after season since before there were men to know of it. But why, in this year, should they suddenly spawn 10, 20 times as many? There must be a reason for this. There is. If some means, or several means, of melting the Arctic ice were put into operation, a little time would have to pass before its effects became mensurable. Moreover, the effects would be progressive, first a trickle, then a gush, then a torrent. I have seen estimates which suggest that if the polar ice were melted, the sea level would rise by 100 feet. To call that an estimate is a shocking imposition. It is no more than a round-figure guess. It may be a good guess, or it may be widely wrong on either side. The only certainty is that the sea level would indeed rise. In this connection, I draw attention to the fact that in January of this year, the mean sea level at Newlyn, where it is customarily measured, was reported to have risen by 2.5 inches. "Oh, dear," said Phyllis, when she had read this. "Of all the pertinacious stickers out of necks, we'd better go and see him." It did not entirely surprise us when we telephoned the next morning to find that his number was not available. When we called, however, we were admitted. Bocker got up from a desk littered with mail to greet us. "No earthly good your coming here," he told us. "There isn't a sponsor that'd touch me with a 40-foot pole." "Oh, I'd not say that, A.B., Phyllis told him. "You will very likely find yourself immensely popular with the sellers of sandbags and makers of earth-shifting machinery before long." He took no notice of that. "You'll probably be contaminated if you associate with me. In most countries I'd be under arrest by now." "Terribly disappointing for you. This has always been discouraging territory for ambitious martyrs. But you do try, don't you?" she responded. "Now look, A.B.," she went on, "do you really like to have people throwing things at you, or what is it?" "I get impatient," explained Bocker. "Well, so do other people, but nobody I know has quite your gift for going just beyond what people are willing to take at any given moment. One day you'll get hurt. Not this time, because luckily you've messed it up, but one time certainly." "If not this time, then probably not at all," he said. He bent a thoughtful, disapproving look on her. "Just what do you mean, young woman, by coming here and telling me I messed it up?" The anticlimax. First you sounded as if you were on the point of great revelations, but then that was followed by a rather vague suggestion that somebody or something must be causing the Arctic changes, and without any specific explanation of how it could be done. And then your grand finale was that the tide is 2.5 inches higher. Bocker continued to regard her. "Well, so it is. I don't see what's wrong with that. 2.5 inches is a colossal amount of water when it's spread over 141 million square miles. If you reckon it up in tons, I never do reckon water in tons, and that's part of the point. To ordinary people, 2.5 inches just means a very slightly higher mark on a post. After your build-up, it sounded so tiddly that everyone feels annoyed with you for alarming them. Those that don't just laugh and say, 'Ha-ha, these professors.'" Bocker waved his hand at the desk with its load of mail. "Quite a lot of people have been alarmed, or at least indignant," he said. He lit a cigarette. "That was what I wanted. You know well enough how it has been since the beginning of this business. At every stage the great majority, and particularly the authorities, have resisted the evidence as long as they could. This is a scientific age, in the more educated strata. It will therefore almost fall over backwards in disregarding the abnormal, and it has developed a deep suspicion of its own senses. Vast quantities of evidence are required before a theory based on scanty knowledge can be dislodged. Very reluctantly, the existence of something in the deeps was belatedly conceded. There has been equal reluctance to admit all the succeeding manifestations until they couldn't be dodged. And now here we are again, balking at the newest hurdle. Ever since this business in the Arctic began, a number of people have been well aware of what must be going on, though not, of course, of how it is being done. But for one reason or another, not excluding governmental pressure, they have been keeping quiet about it. I have myself. That doesn't sound quite true to form, I suggested. He grinned briefly and then went on. I misjudged it. Several of us did. When the purpose of the thing was clear, I doubted it. This time, I said to myself, they really have bitten off more than they can chew. There wasn't any point in alarming people unnecessarily. Things are bad enough already, so as long as it was possible to hope that the attempt on the ice was going to fail, it was better to say nothing in public, a sort of semi-voluntary censorship. But the Americans, same attitude, if anything a bit more so. Business is their national sport, and like most national sports, semi-sacred. A still bigger slump than they have been having since the shipping trouble started wouldn't help anyone. So we all watched and waited. We've not been altogether idle, though. The Arctic Ocean is deep, and even more difficult to get at than the others, so there was some bombing where the fog patches occurred, but the devil of it is there's no way of telling results. Also, a group of us put into the Admiralty that there were only two ways the things could be getting into the Arctic. They wouldn't be using the Bering Sea route past Alaska because that would give them something like a couple of 1,000 miles in shallow water. So they must be coming up our way between Rockall and Scotland. By cutting through one ridge south of the Faroes, they would have fairly deep water right the way up to the polar basin. Now, by that route, there are two narrow passes they would have to use. We and the Norwegians got together over that, and between us we put down quite a lot of bombs east of Jan Mayen Island and another lot further north between Greenland and Spitsbergen. They may have done something, but again, you can't tell. At best, it can only have meant a bit of delay, because the trouble still went on and new fog patches started up. In the middle of all this, the Muscovite, who seems to be constitutionally incapable of understanding anything to do with the sea, started making trouble. The sea, he appeared to be arguing, was causing a great deal of inconvenience to the West. Therefore, it must be acting on good dialectically materialistic principles, and I have no doubt that if he could contact the deeps, he would like to make a pact with their inhabitants for a brief period of dialectical opportunism. Anyway, he led off, as you know, with the accusations of aggression, and then, in the back and forth that followed, began to show such truculence that the attention of our services became diverted from the really serious threat to the antics of this oriental clown who thinks the sea was only created to embarrass capitalists. Thus, we have now arrived at a situation where the Bathies, as they call them, far from falling down on the job as we had hoped, are going ahead fast. And all the brains and organisations that should be working flat out at planning to meet the emergency are congenially fooling around with those ills they have and ignoring others that they would rather know not of. There are times when one fails to see why God thought it necessary to devise the ostrich. So you decided that the time had come to force their hands by blowing the gaff, I asked. Yes, but not alone. This time I had the company of a number of eminent and very worried men. Mine was only the opening shot at the wider public on this side of the Atlantic. My weighty companions, who have not already lost their reputations over this business, are working more subtly. As for the American end, well, just take a look at Life and Collier's this next week. Oh yes, something is going to be done. What? Asked Phyllis. He looked at her thoughtfully for a moment, then shook his head slightly. That, thank God, is someone else's department. At least it will be when the public forces them to admit the situation. But what can they do? Phyllis repeated. He hesitated. Then he said, This is between ourselves. Not a word of it have you heard from me. The only possible thing that I can see for them to do is to organize salvage, to make sure that certain things and people are not lost. That, I have no doubt, they will start to do immediately the reality of the danger has been accepted. The rest will have to take their chance, and I'm afraid that for most of us it won't be much of a chance. Like preparations for a war, move great works of art and important people away to safe places, suggested Phyllis. Exactly, almost too exactly. Phyllis frowned. Just what do you mean by that, A.B.? He shook his head. They will think in terms of ordinary war, and I don't trust the sense of values that will operate. Art treasures? Yes, no doubt they will try to preserve them, but at the cost of what else? Call me a Philistine if you like, but art really only became art in the last 2 centuries. Essentially, before that it was furniture for improving one's home. Well, we seem to get along all right, although we lost the Cro-Magnon art for some thousands of years. But should we have done so if it had been the knowledge of fire that we had lost? And important people? Who is important? Some Norman or pre-Norman blood must run in the veins of every Englishman of 3 generations standing, but I have no doubt that those who can trace it back by a list of names on paper will be considered to have prior claims to survival. Certain eminent intellectuals are likely to be tolerated too, on the strength of honours earned in the days when they had fresh ideas. How many will be among the elite because they still have ideas remains to be seen. As for the ordinary man, much his wisest course would be to enlist in a regiment with a famous name. There'll be a use for him. Come off it, A.B. It's many years now since you even looked like a cynical undergraduate, said Phyllis. Bocker grinned, and then wiped the grin off just as suddenly. All the same, it is going to be a very bloody business, he said seriously. What I want to know, Phyllis and I began simultaneously. Your turn, Mike, she offered. Well, mine is, how do you think the thing's being done? Melting the Arctic seems a pretty formidable proposition. There have been a number of guesses. They range from an incredible operation like piping warm water up from the tropics to tapping the Earth's central heat, which I find just about as unlikely. But you have your own idea, I suggested, for it seemed improbable that he had not. Well, I thought it might be done this way. We know that they have some kind of device that will project a jet of water with considerable force. The bottom sediment that was washed up into surface currents in a continuous flow pretty well proved that. Well then, a contraption like that, used in conjunction with a heater, say an atomic reaction pile, ought to be capable of generating a quite considerable warm current. The obvious snag there is that we don't know whether they have atomic fission or not. So far there's been no indication that they have, unless you count our presenting them with at least one atomic bomb that didn't go off. But if they do have it, I think that might be an answer. They could get the necessary uranium? Why not? After all, they have forcibly established their rights, mineral and otherwise, over more than 2/3 of the world's surface. Oh yes, they could get it all right, if they know about it. And the iceberg angle? That's less difficult. In fact, there is pretty general agreement that if one has a vibratory type of weapon that can cause a ship to fall to pieces, there ought to be no great difficulty in causing a lump of ice, even a considerable sized lump of ice, to crack. And nobody knows of anything we can do about it. It boils down to this. We simply don't think the same way. When you consider it, practically all our strategy of defence or attack is based on our ability to deliver or resist missiles of one kind or another, whereas they don't seem to be interested in missiles at all. At least you could scarcely call a pseudo-Celenterate a missile. Another thing, and this is one of those that keeps the backroom boys stumped, is that they don't use iron or any ferrous metals, which knocks out a whole range of possible magnetic approaches. In war, you have at least a rough idea of the way your enemy must be thinking, so you can put up appropriate counter-thoughts. But with these brutes, it's nearly always some slant we haven't explored. If they drove those sea tanks with any kind of engine known to us, we could have picked them up well offshore and destroyed them. But whatever does make them go, it obviously isn't an engine in our sense of the term at all. The answer, as with Celenterates, is probably up some biological avenue that we simply haven't discovered to exist. So how the devil do we start understanding it, let alone produce an opposing form? We've only got the weapons we know, and they're not the right ones for this job. Always the same fundamental trouble. How the hell do you find out what is going on 5 miles down? Suppose we can't find a way of hindering the process. How long do you think it'll take before we're in real trouble? I asked him. He shrugged. I've absolutely no idea. As far as the glaciers and the ice cap are concerned, it presumably depends on how hard they work at it. But directing warm currents on pack ice would presumably show only small results to begin with, and then increase rapidly, very likely by a geometrical progression. Worse than useless to guess with no data at all. Once this gets into people's heads, they're going to want to know the best thing to do, Phyllis said. What would you advise? Isn't that the government's job? It's because it's high time they thought about doing some advising that we've blown the gaff, as Mike put it. My own personal advice is too impractical to be worth much. What is it? Phyllis asked. Find a nice, self-sufficient hilltop and fortify it, said Bocker simply. The campaign did not get off to the resounding start that Bocker had hoped. In England, it had the misfortune to be adopted by the Nethermore press and was consequently regarded as stunt territory, wherein it would be unethical for other journalistic feet to trespass. In America, it did not stand out greatly among the other excitements of the week. In both countries, there were interests which preferred that it should seem to be no more than a stunt. France and Italy took it more seriously, but their government's political weight in world councils was lighter. Russia ignored the content, but explained the purpose. It was yet another move by cosmopolitan fascist warmongers to extend their influence in the Arctic. Nevertheless, official indifference was slightly breached, Bocker assured us. A committee on which the services were represented had been set up to inquire and make recommendations. A similar committee in Washington, D.C. also inquired in a leisurely fashion until it was brought up sharply by the state of California. The average Californian was not greatly worried by a rise of a couple of inches in the tide level. He had been much more delicately stricken. Something was happening to his climate. The average of his seaboard temperature had gone way down, and he was having cold, wet fogs. He disapproved of that, and a large number of Californians disapproving makes quite a noise. Oregon and Washington, too, rallied to support their neighbour. Never within the compass of their statistical records had there been so cold and unpleasant a winter. It was clear to all parties that the increased flow of ice and cold water pouring out of the Bering Sea was being swept eastward by the Kuroshio current from Japan, and patent to at least one of the parties that the amenities of the most important state of the Union were suffering gravely. Something must be done. In England, the spur was applied when the April-spring tides overflowed the embankment wall at Westminster. Assurances that this had happened a number of times before and was devoid of particular significance were swept aside by the triumphant "we told you so" of the Nethermore press. A hysterical bomb the bathies demand sprang up on both sides of the Atlantic and spread round the world, except for the intransigent Sixth. Foremost, as well as the first, in the Bomb the Bathies movement, the Nethermore press inquired, morning and evening, what is the bomb for? Billions have been spent upon this bomb, which appears to have no other destiny but to be held up and shaken threateningly, or from time to time to provide pictures for our illustrated newspapers. Having made it, we were too scared to use it in Korea. Now it seems we are too scared to use it on the Bathies. The first reluctance was understandable. The present one is unforgivable. The people of the world, having evolved and paid for this weapon, are now forbidden to use it against a menace that has sunk our ships, closed our oceans, snatched men and women from our very shores, and now threatens to drown us. Procrastination and ineptitude has from the beginning marked the attitude of the authorities in this affair, and so on, with the earlier bombings of the deeps apparently forgotten by writers and readers alike. "Working up nicely now," said Bocker when we saw him next. "It seems pretty silly to me," Phyllis told him bluntly. "All the same old arguments against the indiscriminate bombing of deeps still apply." "Oh, not that part," Bocker said. "They'll probably drop a few bombs here and there with plenty of publicity and no results. No, I mean the planning. We're now in the first stage of stupid suggestions like building immense levees of sandbags, of course. But it is getting across that something has got to be done." It got across still more strongly after the next spring tides. There had been strengthening of the sea defences everywhere. In London, the riverside walls had been reinforced and topped for their whole length with sandbags. As a precaution, traffic had been diverted from the embankment, but the crowds turned out to throng it and the bridges on foot. The police did their best to keep them moving, but they dawdled from one point to another, watching the slow rise of the water, waving to the crews of passing tugs and barges which presently were riding above the road level. They seemed equally ready to be indignant if the water should break through, or disappointed if there were an anticlimax. They were not disappointed. The water lapped slowly above the parapet and against the sandbags. Here and there began to trickle through onto the pavements. Firemen, civil defence and police watched their sections anxiously, rushing bags to reinforce wherever a trickle enlarged, shoring up weak-looking spots with timber struts. The pace gradually became hotter. The bystanders began to help, dashing from one point to another as new jets started up. Presently there could be little doubt what was going to happen. Some of the watching crowd withdrew, but many of them remained, in a wavering fascination. When the breakthrough came, it occurred in a dozen places on the north bank almost simultaneously. Among the spurting jets, a bag or two would begin to shift, then suddenly came a collapse, and a gap several yards wide through which the water poured as if over a weir. From where we stood, on top of an EBC van parked on Vauxhall Bridge, we were able to see 3 separate rivers of muddy water pouring into the streets of Westminster, filling basements and cellars as they went, and presently merging into one flood. Our commentator handed over to another, perched on a Pimlico roof. For a minute or two we switched over to the BBC to find out how their crew on Westminster Bridge was faring. We got onto them just in time to hear Bob Humbleby describing the flooded Victoria embankment, with the water now rising against New Scotland Yard's own second line of defences. The television boys didn't seem to be doing too well. There must have been a lot of bets lost on where the breakthrough would occur, but they were putting up a struggle with the help of telephoto lenses and portable cameras. From that point on, the thing got thick and fast. On the south bank, water was breaking into the streets of Lambeth, Southwark and Bermondsey in a number of places. Upriver, it was seriously flooding Chiswick. Downriver, Limehouse was getting it badly, and more places kept on reporting breaks until we lost track of them. There was little to be done but stand by for the tide to drop, and then rush the repairs against its next rise. The House out-questioned any quiz. The replies were more assured than assuring. The relevant ministries and departments were actively taking all the steps necessary. Claims should be submitted through local councils. Priorities of men and material had already been arranged. Yes, warnings had been given, but unforeseen factors had intruded upon the hydrographer's original calculations. An order in council would be made for the requisition of all earth-moving machinery. The public could have full confidence that there would be no repetition of the calamity. The measures already put in hand would ensure against any further extension. Little could be done beyond rescue work in eastern counties at present. That would of course continue, but the most urgent matter at the moment was to ensure that the water could make no further inroads at the next high tides. The requisition of materials, machines and manpower was one thing. Their apportionment, with every seaboard community and low-lying area clamouring for them simultaneously, quite another. Clerks in half a dozen ministries grew pale and heavy-eyed in a welter of demands, allocations, adjustments, redirections, misdirections, subornments and downright thefts. But somehow, and in some places, things began to get done. Already there was great bitterness between those who were chosen and those who looked like being thrown to the wolves. Phyllis went down one afternoon to look at progress of work on the riverside. Amid great activity on both banks, a superstructure of concrete blocks was arising on the existing walls. The sidewalk supervisors were out in their thousands to watch. Among them she chanced upon Bocker. Together they ascended to Waterloo Bridge and watched the termite-like activity with a celestial eye for a while. Alf, the sacred river, and more than twice 5 miles of walls and towers, Phyllis observed. And there are going to be some deep but not very romantic chasms on either side too, said Bocker. I wonder how high they'll go before the futility comes home to them. It's difficult to believe that anything on such a scale as this can be really futile, but I suppose you're right, said Phyllis. Bocker waved a hand at it. The basis of all this is an assurance by that old fool Stackley, who is a geographer who knows damn all about oceans, that the overall rise cannot be more than 10 or 12 feet at the most. Heaven knows what he bases it on. A desire to create full employment by the look of it. Some departments have accepted that as the authentic dope. They seem to think they can muddle through this thing as they muddle through their wars. Others, thank God, have a bit more sense. However, this isn't being interfered with because it is felt that some kind of show is necessary for morale. I've had to speak to you about this undergraduate attitude before, A.B., said Phyllis. What is being done that's useful? Oh, they're working out plans, Bocker said, with deliberate vagueness. They continued to regard the medley of men and machinery down below for a time. Well, Bocker remarked at length, there must be at least one figure among the shades who is getting a hell of a good laugh out of this. Nice to think there's even one, Phyllis said. Who? King Canute, said Bocker.
Kraken Wakes was written by John Wyndham and read by Stephen Moore, and the programme was produced in Belfast by Susan Carson.